This was the day I lost both my hands. On this June day in 1944, someone else's fingers were writing down my words in my diary. But there just weren't any words for many of the things I thought of. I had a lot of time for thinking. I had all day and more of the night than anyone knew. Crazy thinking at first. Like remembering a kid's party where they tied my hands behind my back and made me take a bite out of an apple hanging by a string. I thought of the time in the meat market where I worked before the war, when I sliced the tip of my right middle finger and had to get along with my left hand for a week. Just the tip of one finger, yet I was 50% helpless. How would it be now with stumps instead of fingers and palms and wrists? How would it be when I couldn't even handle a cigarette by myself? Then I began to remember stories from civilian days of armless men who learned to paint good pictures with the brushes held between the toes. And back home, I'd heard of a woman without hands who knitted sweaters for the Red Cross with her feet. That wasn't much of a comfort. It was clever, and it was okay if someone's ambition were to paint portraits or knit sweaters with his feet. But it wasn't what I wanted. With the help of my neighbors, I could get by. I found that out early and felt better for it. But I didn't want to go through life dependent on others. Most of us in the ward felt that way. Days, we'd kid each other and have plenty of laughs, but after lights out, I wasn't the only one who'd stare into the dark, thinking. I still thought of that kid's game with the apple on the string. Rip, who fixed it up for me to smoke, probably thought of other things, like walking across a frozen lake on stilts. He'd lost both feet at Anzio. One thing I envied the others, though. They got theirs in combat. I got mine on D-Day, all right, but it was in North Carolina when half a pound of TNT exploded ahead of schedule. I didn't have a German scalp hanging from my belt. I didn't have a Purple Heart. I didn't even have an overseas ribbon. All I had was no hands. Then, 3 weeks after I went into the ward, something came along that made a big difference to all of us lying there day after day, worrying and wondering. They'd shown us movies before, but they said this one was special. This one was made by the Army just for us. There wasn't a single blonde in it, but they said we'd all feel better if we'd take time out to meet McGonagall.
This is my neighbor, Charles McGonigal. I'd like you to meet him. I think he's an interesting fellow. Watch him shaving, for instance. What's unusual about that? Well, Charlie has no hands. No hands other than these ingenious substitutes. But he does things as easily and...
We were a tough audience for movies. The day before, one of our guys who left a foot at Kwajalein had thrown his crutch at the screen when the hero recited poetry to some pin-up girl. But we listened hard this day, all of us. Johnny with one leg, Buck Archie, one arm. Bailey, one leg. Red, one arm. Cradella, no legs. Papa Frank, one leg. And me. I listened because here was a man named Charlie McGonigal, a man without hands since the last war, doing all the everyday things I thought I'd never do again. Doing them with hooks. Nothing fancy like pole vaulting or repairing watches or even knitting with his feet. Just the acts of normal living like shaving and eating and dressing himself.
He does it alone from the first sock to the final tilt of his hat. His vest, instead of buttoning up in the regular way, hooks together for convenience sake. Charlie can handle buttons, but the hooks are time savers. In a world where the tendency has always been to streamline time, there are forecasts, the zipper vest that you and I will be wearing when Hitler and Hirohito are things you talk about only in the past tense, like Dillinger and Model T.
Even the leg boys seemed encouraged by what they saw on the screen. It showed them what a man could do if he tried.
Charlie has none of the characteristics of a Superman. He's a man who lived normally before the war, and he set himself no goal but to live normally after it. He succeeded because he had patience. He had faith in himself. He knew it could be done. It took a little while, but he got there.
Right then I knew I could get there too. Perhaps even a little faster than McGonigal. After seeing the picture, for the first time I really put something into the daily calisthenics. I didn't just fan the air with my arms anymore. I worked out as though I had a date to play in the Rose Bowl on New Year's Day. Actually, it was going to be a bigger show than the Rose Bowl. The date I had was with McGonigal's way of living. Place, the normal world. Time, that was a big question mark. I spoke to the doc about it and said I was figuring on about 3 months, like McGonigal. Well, he said, maybe 6. If I'd said 6 months, he'd probably have said maybe 9. That's the way they were in the hospital, cautious. They didn't want to build us up to a letdown. The doc told me to begin toning up in what we called the workshop, which was less of a mouthful than the orthopedic occupational therapy shop. With the cuff attachment, things became easier right away. I wrote the words, "Dear Mother," again. I hadn't done that since June the 5th, 5 weeks before. The writing wasn't as pretty as it used to be, but it could be read, and it was my own. I discovered that I owed a great debt to the man who invented the typewriter, and to the nurses who were patient when I got the keys into a traffic jam. Ping pong helped limber up my arms and shoulders. I couldn't reach the ones on the far outside, but my control was good, and I won more games than I lost. August the 3rd was a great day. Less than 6 weeks after my accident, the doctor told me my stumps looked okay, and it was time he gave me some new hands. Well, I felt like turning a couple of cartwheels, but that wasn't quite possible. So I just thanked him and made a date to go downstairs. It used to take Chubby an hour to make a plaster cast in civilian life, but he was having more customers these days and could do it in a breeze. Chubby assured me I'd be dealing myself a Pat Royal flush a month from now. A month? That was more like it. Well, said Chubby, maybe 6 months. Everyone was playing it cozy. There was nothing left to chance with the plastic forearms called buckets. They had to fit snugly with no more tolerance than you'd find in the cylinders of a P-38. The reach had to be just right. Everything had to be just right because these were going to be my new hands. Strong enough to carry a trunk, sensitive enough to thread a needle. Some fellows have dress hands with fingers that would fool anyone when covered with a glove, but there's not much you can do with them except look pretty. I got my prostheses, as they're called, a week after Chubby took the mold, and the doc explained just how to work them. The normal position of the hooks is with the tips together, locked by strong elastic bands. Each hook is opened by a cord which is pulled by moving the opposite shoulder. It had been nearly 6 weeks since I'd held anything under my own control, and that had been half a pound of TNT in North Carolina. I got quite a kick out of holding that pencil. When I came back to the ward, I couldn't help flashing my new hooks. I sure felt cocky. I puffed casually on a cigarette and swaggered as though I'd won the Medal of Honor with Oak Leaf Cluster.